Thank you for having me. I've had many day ones. And in fact, the way I live my life now, when I wake up in the morning, each day is a new day one for me. I'm going to talk about some of the ones that I remember over the last 47 years of my life that have had real impact on me. And some of my day ones are great, and some of my day ones are awful. But it is true that each day I get to try again and try to be a better version of me and try to do a better version of whatever it is that I want to do. The first one that I really remember that was profound was when I was 10 years old. My father is a doctor, and his father, when he was young, said to him, son, you can do anything you want as long as you're a doctor. At 10, my father would take me to the hospital on rounds. He had an office. I would go to his office, and he was an entrepreneur. He started his own private practice. It grew to be a fairly large practice in Dallas, Texas, where I grew up. I never liked hospitals. I didn't like the noise. I didn't like the lights. I didn't like the people. I didn't like the smells. Just didn't like them. And I was 10, and he had a little book on endocrinology, which is the subspecialty that he did. And I read the book at 10. I probably understood nothing in the book except for the word endocrinology. And I was sitting with him, and I said, Dad, I don't really want to be a doctor. And he told me the story of what his dad told him. And then he said to me, son, you can be anything you want. And that was my first. That was a moment where I realized I could do anything I wanted to do. I could be anything I wanted to be. I got to define my own path. The next one I remember was when I was 13. I got bar mitzvahed. And like every young Jewish boy that gets bar mitzvahed, it was a stressful, challenging experience that resulted in a big party and lots of checks being handed to me. And my mother told me not to open them until after we went home. Of course, I went in the bathroom and would start opening them to see what people gave me. And I had about $1,500. And my father again said to me, what do you want to get with your money? And all my friends at this time were buying Krugerrands, were buying gold. That was in 1984. That was the thing that all the kids in Dallas, Texas that got bar mitzvahed bought. I said to my dad, I want to buy an Apple II computer. And he sort of looked at me. I said, I want a computer. He said, all right, let's go buy you an Apple II computer. So we went to the one computer store that was in Dallas in 1984, or 1983. And we found an Apple II computer, and I had $1,500, and we put it all together, and we bought one of the very early Apple II computers, and it cost about $3,000. And I looked at him with this kind of a look. I said, tell you what, I'll match you one for one. So I got an Apple II computer at 13, and that was magical for me because I had this thing that I could lose myself in. And up to that point, I was very into tennis. I was a huge tennis player. And I like to say the thing that derailed me from being a serious tennis player was my Apple II computer and discovering girls. And that was the end of tennis. But that was the beginning of me starting to understand that I could really create any kind of technology I wanted. I could experiment with this computer and I could create my own world. And I was fascinated with it. I was always a good student, but I was really absorbed when I was thinking, when I was playing with the computer. A couple of years later, I wrote some software on the Apple II for my father's medical practice, and I sold it back to him for $2,000. So I made about $500 on the experience, which was another day one where I learned the value of investing my time and energy in something that resulted in an economic outcome for me. I went to MIT, and in October, my freshman year, I was extremely homesick. I was living in Boston. I'd grown up in Dallas from the time I was 3. My parents came to visit me for one of the first family weekends. It was the first time I was seeing them. And we wandered around in Concord, Mass., which is a little town near Boston that's a historic town. My parents liked to drag me to museums as a kid. Now I like museums, but when I was a kid, I hated it. And they loved to drag me to historic places as a kid. I hated it. Now I like to do that. It's shocking. We're wandering around Concord on this fall day, and I'm just so depressed. I'm so frustrated. I just don't want to be here. I'm not having fun. MIT is hard. I'm lonely. I miss my girlfriend. I miss my friends who are all at the University of Texas. And my mother's sort of being, comforting me in the conversation. It'll be okay, fight through it. My father looks at me and says, give it a year. Just give it a year. If at the end of a year you don't want to do it anymore, you can do anything you want. You can transfer to UT, but give yourself a year. Do yourself a favor and give yourself a year. And I did. And a year later, I still didn't love MIT, but I loved the experience. And I realized that being there was a powerful thing for what I wanted to do and how I wanted to do it. I had found some new friends. I got over being homesick. I suffered for the 7 years I was there. I got a couple of degrees. I like to say going to MIT is a daily assault on your self-esteem. It's just one of those places that's so incredibly hard, but it tempers you in a way. It gives you a level of muscle and rigor and determination to get through really challenging things. So that was another key day one for me when my father said, give it a year. And what I took that to, I've thought many times along the way about quitting different things. I've had a number of companies that were successful and a number of companies that I've been involved in that weren't successful. And whenever I feel like quitting something or shutting a company down or walking away from something, I try it on every day for a month. So I wake up in the morning and I say, what would life be like if? And I use that every day. And I go about my day and I have my day, but I think about it at the beginning of the day and the end of the day. And in many cases, that month has caused me to decide to double down on the thing I was working on and keep going harder after it. And in other cases, that month has caused me to decide, I'm done with that. It's time to call it quits. It's not going to work. I don't give it a year. That feels too long. But that month was important. My first real job was working as the first employee of a software company, a husband and wife company called Petcom. And the founders were Chris and Helena Aves, who I met through a friend of my father, a patient of my father's. And they were writing software for personal computers at a time when nobody wrote software for personal computers yet. It was still mini computers and other sorts of stuff. This was for oil and gas, for the oil and gas industry in Texas. Accounting systems. I wrote an economic analysis, forecasting, scientific system to help figure out sort of what the oil well drill in a certain place might be worth. And the deal I cut with them, or they cut with me, I should say, because I didn't really know that I was cutting a deal with them, was that they paid me $10 an hour plus 5% of gross sales for the software I wrote. They thought they were getting a great deal because I only cost them $10 an hour. I didn't know whether I was getting a great deal or not, but I figured out that if I worked 80 hours a week, I made more money than if I worked 40 hours a week. So that was a good starting point. And then as a freshman in college, I'd written some software that one of the products was pretty successful. And I would get checks for $2,500 in the mail or $5,000 in the mail. One time I got a check for $10,000, a little bit over $10,000 in the mail each month. They would send me a royalty check. And at a very young age, I learned the power of having some ownership in the thing you're doing. Now, they own the company, but I got to benefit directly from the work that I was doing. That was powerful. The next year when I went home for the summer, I worked for them full time, and the company had grown from 3 people to 25 people. They had built a pretty big company. It had scaled up. They had funded it themselves. It was going well. And that summer, the price of oil went from $30 a barrel to $10 a barrel. And at the end of the summer, there were 3 people left, the 2 of them and me. So I learned very early, another day one experience. Scaling up a business doesn't mean that it's going to necessarily work. In their particular case, the business didn't fail, but they had to cut back. They ended up reinventing that business and creating off the software that we'd created a totally different business that ended up being successful. In college, I met my first partner, my first business partner, a fellow named Dave Jilk. And Dave and I were friends all through college, and we did some things together. He was a couple of years older than me. And I started my first company, Feld Technologies, when I was in college. And another day one moment is never name your company after yourself. Because I had a partner named Dave Jilk, but when people were mad, they didn't call for Mr. Jilk. They called for Mr. Feld, even if it was his problem. And when I got done with my undergraduate degree, the two of us joined up as partners and started building this company. And it was self-funded. We grew it over 7 years to about 20 people. We had to make money because we didn't raise any money, so we were profitable every month. He was a great partner. We're very different. We fought a lot. We argued a lot, but the fights were intellectual fights. They weren't fist fights. I don't think we ever actually had a real fist fight. But we had plenty of verbal ones. But we learned a lot from each other, and we were completely dedicated to each other. We totally trusted each other. We were all in on the relationship as partners. And I had my ups and downs, and he had his ups and downs personally and functionally through that process. But it was very powerful for me to have a partnership early on in my career that was so strong, because it gave me an understanding of the power of a strong partnership. And I've had some that were strong and some that were not. And when I look at where I am today, the only partnerships I want at age 47 are ones that are strong. The only people I want to work with are people who really want to work with me and who I really want to work with. And I learned that from my experience at Feld Technologies with Dave. 7 years into our business, we had a successful business, but we were bored. Business was doing fine. We made money. People called for Mr. Feld that were unhappy about whatever, but we kept sort of figuring out how to do what we did better. But I'd wake up in the morning and I wasn't learning what I wanted to learn. And it's something that, as I've worked with many entrepreneurs, I've found many people go through, is you get to a point of success and you feel lost in what you're doing. You lose your sense of purpose and your sense of mission for your business. And this was the moment where I'd lost that sense of purpose and sense of mission for this first company. And that went on for quite some time. And it actually led to a real depression on my part, where I could get up out of bed, I could go to work, I was very functional as a CEO, and then I'd come home and I'd sit in the bathtub for 2 hours. I just didn't have any energy left. I used it all up just being able to work through this business. And I realized at some point that the business wasn't satisfying to me, but I didn't know what to do. We had a business, we had lots of customers, we had lots of employees. Out of the blue, I got approached by a fellow named Len Fassler. And Len showed up one day. He had bought a company, his company had bought a company that we worked with, and they had recommended that he talk to us. Went and had lunch with Len at a restaurant in Boston where I was living, around the corner from our office. We sat, we had a nice lunch. I had no idea why I was having lunch with Len, other than he was a nice guy, and he clearly had a successful business, and he was older, and he was very generous and very, good questions and very interested. And at the end of lunch, he says, "Brad, I'd like to buy your company." I had no idea. It wasn't even in my mind that was a conversation. I was flattered and confused and struggled, and Dave and I really didn't know what to make of it. And we went down and we met with Len and his partner Jerry, and they made us an offer. They had their office in Connecticut near New York. We drove down, made an offer. We sat with them. We felt like we had a deal. We came back. And immediately, I started struggling with whether I should sell the company or not. And on Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, I wanted to sell. And Tuesdays, Thursdays, Saturdays, I didn't want to sell. And on Sundays, I rested. And at some point, Dave said, "Enough. Just whatever you want to do, just decide." And I'm like, I don't know what I want to do. A couple of weeks went by, and I called Len, and I said, I don't know what I want to do. Like, I really like you guys, but I'm confused. He says, "Look, Brad, the offer stands. We'd really like to buy your company. Call us when you're ready." A couple of months later, we were ready. We called him, and the offer stood, and they bought our company. That was another powerful moment for me, this notion that when you make a deal, you make a deal. He could have played games with us. He could have retraded the deal. He could have, said, you have to decide by Friday or else no deal. He was very calm about it. because Len really wanted to work with us. And that helped me understand how powerful that is when you're on the buying side of something or the investing side of something. That it's not about the contract, it's not about the lawyers, it's not about the negotiation. It's about, do you want to work with me and do I want to work with you? I told my wife, Amy, that when we sold Feld Technologies, when we sold Feld Technologies, I told Amy that by the time I was 30, I was 28 at the time, by the time I was 30, we'd leave Boston. She had grown up in Alaska, and I'd grown up in Dallas, Texas. Boston wasn't home for either of us. And 2 months before I turned 30, Amy told me she was moving to Boulder and I was welcome to come with her. We were married at the time, so I would say it was an offer, but it was a pretty strong offer on her part. So we moved to Boulder, and we knew one person, and he moved away 3 months later. This was another key moment in my life, this decision to move and live where I wanted to live and where we wanted to live as a couple versus go somewhere to work. And we didn't know if Boulder would be the place we were going to stay. We were willing to try it for a year or two. And if we didn't like it, we'd try something else. And it was our friends in Boston who'd been hearing us bitch about Boston for many years. You know, we're going to leave, we're going to leave, we're going to leave. They don't even notice we left. We just packed up the stuff and left. And that was 1995. 6 months later, we knew Boston was home, or Boulder was home for the rest of our life. So this is a very powerful notion of how important it is to choose where you want to live your life rather than have it chosen for you or feel like you have to be somewhere. I went on to invest in a bunch of companies as an angel investor. I started investing with some of the money that I made from selling my first company. Some of those companies were very successful. Some of them were failures. But I had a lot of fun doing that, and I was doing that around the country. One of the companies that I started was a company that I started with Len and two other founders, an entrepreneur named Raj Bhargava, who I've done a number of things with, and another entrepreneur named Steve Maggs, who was also at this company that Len ran that had bought my first company. Len had sold his company, or his company was acquired by GE. He was retired, but we convinced him to unretire. And we started a company in 1996. And that company bought about 20 companies and grew to be about a 2,000-person company, went public in 1999, had a couple of $1 billion market cap at the peak in 2000, and went bankrupt in 2002. So it was a classic internet bubble story of huge growth. We grew to about $200 million in revenue, but we mastered the art of losing $5 million a month. And when the markets turned and growth was no longer what the markets favored and now you had to be profitable, we tried as hard as we could to get the company profitable. And by the time we went bankrupt, it was actually making a little bit of money. But the way we did that was through laying people off and selling off pieces of the business and just trying anything we could to get to a stable place. And we just weren't able to in a place where the equity in the business ended up being worth anything. That company ended up getting bought out of bankruptcy by another company. But another experience, if you remember the one that Chris and Helena had, where their business scaled up to 24 people and then collapsed. This business also scaled up to 2,000 people, but then in the end wasn't successful. And along the way, it's very, very difficult. Many, many tough days along the way of the decline of that business. And another day one for me was Len and I would stay at Len's house when I go to New York. And I was in New York a lot these days working on stuff. And we'd get up in the morning and he'd basically say, hey, Brad, suit up. Let's go. He had this way of just like, let's go each morning. And I was probably just looking very despondent this particular day. And Len said, hey, look, Brad, no matter what happens, they can't kill you and they can't eat you. And whenever I'm really, really, really under attack and really struggling, I remember those words. They can't kill you and they can't eat you. Another day one that happened around this period of time, if for those of you that know the history of the internet bubble, I made a bunch of investments as a venture capitalist from 1997 to 2000. I had a number of companies that are very successful, and the number of investments kept coming faster and faster. And then at some point along the way, the internet bubble started to collapse. And because I'd made so many investments, I had a really horrible year in 2001. Many of the companies I was an investor in failed and struggled, and every day was a bad day. You know how you wake up in the morning and you think today, or you wake up in the morning and you're like, okay, new day. You go through the day. At the end of the day, you're like, wow, that day sucked. You go to bed, you're like, all right, tomorrow's going to be better. You have a scotch or whatever you do to relax in the evening, and I'm going to try again tomorrow. I realized by June of that year that every day had been worse than the previous day. So I decided to change my perspective. And instead of think that the next day was going to be better, I just said, what's the world going to bring me today? And I went back to this, every day was new. And I had a bunch more shitty days, but I got through it eventually, and it got better. In this time period, Amy and I, who had been together for now about a decade, Amy said to me one day, we're on a weekend together, it's a Friday night, we're visiting friends, I take a phone call in the middle of dinner, I come back to dinner at dessert, I'm completely distracted, I'm not in the moment, I'm not present. We get in bed, and she says to me, I'm done. And I respond, yeah, this was a tough week. I'm really tired, worn out. I'm so glad to have the weekend. And she says, no, you don't understand. I love you, but you're not even a good roommate anymore. I'm done living this way. I'm done having a relationship this way. I'm done. And, I sat quietly for a second. I said, look, I'm not done. Let's talk through this. And she was willing to talk through it. And we would talk for an hour later. We'd learned early on never go to bed angry at each other. So we talked for another hour. And out of that hour, I felt like I talked her off the ledge. And when you've talked somebody off the ledge, you're in bed with your significant other. And you can feel the energy shift from anger to, a little bit of compassion. And so I did something you can only do in that moment, just to make sure everything was okay. And I nudged her and I said, so does this mean I'm not getting any tonight? And she laughed. I didn't get any that night. But I knew that we were okay. We could have the conversation. And that whole weekend we spent talking about what was going on in our relationship. And really what was going on in our relationship was very fundamental, was that everything I was doing was more important than her, from her frame of reference. And I would say that she was the most important thing. My behavior didn't match my words. And that was really the moment that I want to focus on for this. Because in that moment, I decided that the most important thing in my life was my relationship with her. And that everything that I had done up to this point in terms of success and failure and business and things that worked and things that didn't work, that I was my best self when I was with her. And that it wasn't worth anything else in my entrepreneurial arc, anything I accomplished in life, to mess that up. And that then, once I started to understand that, created a totally different frame of reference for me about what I was doing and how I was doing it and why I was doing it. This is about my mid-30s, so it took me until I was almost in my mid-30s to have that moment. All these experiences, lots of good, lots of bad. I'd made plenty of money. I'd had lots of things work. But I had this moment where I realized this thing that was most important to me I wasn't prioritizing, and I didn't have a way to explain how I was behaving the way I was behaving. That changed me, and changed me completely. I've gone on to be involved in many other things. As I talk about, day ones happen every day. I'll end on an upbeat example of something that was very profound and has had a very profound impact. I have a phenomenal partnership with 3 people at a venture firm called Foundry Group. And we're very, very committed to each other in that way that I described being committed to Dave. In my first business, my partners are Seth, Ryan, and Jason. The 4 of us love each other. We're completely dedicated to each other. We're completely committed to each other. And that's a magnificent and powerful thing that I do. But before we started Foundry Group, there was a very interesting thing that happened with somebody else that I didn't know at all. And that person was David Cohen. On a regular basis, I'll have something I call random days, where I just meet with anybody for 15 minutes. And they come in my office, and I have a schedule, and I do these meetings, and off it goes. And on this particular random day, David walks into my office. I've never met him before. And he's nervous, and he slides across the table a piece of paper that's a description of a mentor-driven accelerator. And nobody knows what a mentor-driven accelerator is because they don't exist really. But he describes to me, this is 2006, describes to me his idea of how he wants to change how he's making angel investments. He was a successful entrepreneur. And he wasn't happy making one angel investment here and one angel investment there and not really being engaged. And what he described was this model for engaging the entire startup community in Boulder in helping create 10 companies a year. And I read it, and I listened to him talk for a few minutes, and about 5 or 6 minutes into the conversation, I said, I'm in. I'm committed to helping you fund it. He said he was going to put in $80,000. I said, fine, I'll put in $50,000. He said, well, if you put in $50,000, I have a partner in my first business, David Brown, will put in $50,000. I think I'll call him. I said, fine, I'll make a phone call and see. I call up another friend of mine, a guy named Jared Polis, who's a very successful entrepreneur. And I said, hey, Jared, I'm about to do this cool thing. I'm going to invest $50,000, and I think it's really neat. Can I tell you about it? He says, sure, I'm in. What is it? So we were done in one day. We put together the funding for the first Techstars. And in that first year, we had no idea whether it was going to be great or awful. It was completely an experiment. It was just a thing we were trying. We had an amazing, amazing experience. And lots of people said to us after that first year, bring it to our city. We want to do a Techstars here. And we said, we'll tell you how we do it, but we don't know if this is any good or not. We want to try it again. And so we did it exactly the same way for a second year. And it wasn't until the third year that we felt comfortable enough to bring it anywhere else. And the first place we brought it to was Boston. But that day one with David was so powerful. And David today is a close friend, a close partner, and very close with my partners at Foundry, with Jason, Seth, and Ryan. We're all part of creating something around Techstars and around entrepreneurship and around startup communities that's now having very broad impact. And we're learning an enormous amount from many of the people that we engage with all over the world like I have today. So hopefully that gives you a feel of how day one can be an everyday experience. And sometimes you don't even know what's going to happen. I loved the story earlier about, the phone call and the week passing of anxiety and the show up in a room, and you don't really know how it's going to happen. David probably had 3 months before he met with me. And that was a day that had a huge, huge impact. I'm 47. I still have an enormous amount to learn. Every day continues to be day one. I woke up this morning. I've got some things that I'm very happy about. I've got some things I'm not so happy about. I've got some things that I'm trying to figure out. I wrote a blog post this morning about how I'm going to focus much, much more for the rest of this year on the notion of scaling up businesses rather than starting businesses. I've been doing a lot of startup stuff for the last year in terms of the talks and the research and the thinking. I really decided I need to get my head into the scaling up, which I have a great laboratory for, which is my Foundry Group portfolio. I think you get the chance to invent yourself anew every day, not just as an entrepreneur, but as a human. And I encourage you to take advantage of that.